A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction.
In 1945, the Axis powers of Germany's Third Reich, Italy, and Japan had been soundly defeated by Western Allied forces in World War II. After its close, however, long after the bombs had fallen silent, the peace talks had likewise fallen apart. U.S. President Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin, the respective leaders of the two preeminent world powers, could not bridge the ideological chasm to find the common ground necessary to sign any viable agreements, sparking the Cold War between capitalism and communism, East versus West, the Soviet Union versus the United States of America, and Great Britain to a much lesser extent.
Churchill had failed to achieve the main goal of his post-war policy, the balance of power in Europe. Now the atomic bomb was presenting global politics with completely different priorities.
The distrust and anger each leader had shown for the other thrust the two countries, and by proxy the world, into a new era of intense competition, extreme political subterfuge, and proxy wars. One of the hallmark events was when the Soviet Union attained nuclear capability in September of 1949, because it initiated a strident nuclear arms race spanning decades that was accompanied by the very real and ominous threat of the total annihilation of all life on Earth. On September 23, 1949, President Harry Truman addressed the American public, apprising them that America's worst fears may have most likely taken place in the previous few weeks in the region of Siberia.
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia has created an atomic explosion sends reporters racing for Flushing Meadow, where Russia's Vyshinsky arrives to address the United Nations.
Mr. Vyshinsky, have you got any statement about President Truman's statement on the atomic bomb? Please, excuse me. Does Russia have the atomic bomb? Well, what's your reply to me?
The resulting arms race would officially transcend 8 U.S. presidential administrations. So would the elevated levels of paranoia, and for the most part, rightly so, as it was suspected by officials within Truman circles that there were spies actively funneling top-secret nuclear information to the Soviets. It turned out to be true, and in what was the most egregious breach of sensitive material in the U.S. to date at the time, the discovery served to fan the already growing flames of paranoia that had begun to spread like wildfire throughout U.S. hubs of power in Washington, D.C., as well as throughout the various strata of American society. The investigation first led to an ex-Nazi scientist named Klaus Fuchs, who was arrested by federal authorities. His interrogation led to the other actors in the ring of espionage, including the now infamous Rosenbergs, who were executed for their high crimes of passing top-secret information to the Soviets. Naturally, the growing hysteria over a communist spy network infiltrating the government and the idea of the Soviets striking the U.S. with nuclear weapons became ingrained into society at all levels. The propaganda was from top to bottom. In a sense, the Soviet communists had struck a very damaging psychological blow to the American cultural mindset without ever firing a shot. One that duly had real-world ramifications, considering the fact that spies had burrowed into the highest matter of U.S. national security just years, even months prior. As the notion of the communist threat of nuclear destruction upon the U.S. was passed from one president to the next, the American public dealt with it in their own ways. Those who could became more enthusiastic about preparing for survival, storing food and goods that might be needed. Others took it to a more extreme level by moving to the country or building a fallout shelter, or both. The U.S. government had its own designs for underground facilities, vast underground networks of caves across the U.S., like those at Mount Weather, the Greenbrier Inn, and NORAD in Colorado, were converted to house U.S. command and control personnel in order to preserve national security and the continuity of government in times of a nuclear emergency, including those that housed the newly produced intercontinental ballistic missiles called Minutemen. NORAD became a permanent installation and is America's early warning system that monitors the entire world for any launch of ICBMs. During the tenure of U.S. President John F. Kennedy and his Soviet counterpart Nikita Khrushchev, History witnessed some of the tensest years and most troubling events of the entire Cold War, with copious amounts of rhetoric by both men when in public, while employing a more rational and amicable approach to negotiations and each other when behind closed doors. Author Alice George, in her book titled The Cuban Missile Crisis, The Threshold of Nuclear War, states, "For Kennedy and Khrushchev, this behavior represented a genuine belief that only a strong response could maintain the balance of power, but that reaction also represented an important step in appeasing hardliners in their own countries and allied leaders abroad." As the years progressed forward, the Bay of Pigs fiasco occurred. It was a failed attempt by the Kennedy administration to coalesce with anti-Castro Cuban nationals trained by the CIA to overthrow then-Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, which certainly contributed to strained relations with the communists in Red Square and in Cuba. Meanwhile, the American public were glued to their radios and televisions in a constant effort to stay informed about what amounted to an ongoing nuclear crisis between the two superpowers. Jittery nerves were at new levels. There was also the event that is now referred to as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the USSR covertly built nuclear missile silos not 100 miles from U.S. shores on the island of Cuba and were discovered by U.S. Air Force surveillance. This led to a days-long U.S. naval blockade that could have erupted into a full-scale nuclear conflict at any time. In the USA, people were frightened yet sought to go on with the affairs of their daily lives as best that they could. Finally, several days later, the Soviets agreed to the terms Kennedy put forth, turned their ships around, and removed the missiles from Cuba. Cuba was just one of many smaller battles during the Cold War as several communist-related crises popped up their ugly heads for the U.S. to tamp back down like some game of whack-a-mole. China had its revolution and consolidated under communism in 1949. The Korean War, Sputnik, the Tsar bomb detonation, Laika the dog, Indochina and Vietnam, Cuba, and the Soviets launching the first man into space were all psychological blows to the psyche of the American public and the West. A stream of Soviet threats backed by their fast-moving scientific accomplishments rattled the nerves of the public and would eventually compel President Ronald Reagan to famously call out then-Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in his 1987 speech near the Brandenburg Gate at the Berlin Wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In his own lecture at Westminster College, the primary speechwriter Peter M. Robinson conveys that the speech was controversial before it ever left the planning stage. He remembers that an argument ensued among Reagan's staff, particularly between himself and Colin Powell, over whether those words should have been in the speech, but that in the end, after 7 alternative speeches without the controversial words were drafted, Robinson said Reagan, with a twinkle in his eye, told White House Chief of Staff Ken Duberstein that the words would stay. Many events make up what is known as the Cold War, but the Cold War era could not have happened efficiently without the Soviets attaining nuclear capability in mid to late 1949. It is this key event that enabled the USSR and its brand of communism to have wielded such a heavy hand in international affairs and pursue the path of psychological terror that it did, thus causing the lion's share of havoc and paranoia that came to dominate the thinking mind of the average Westerner during the Cold War.
And where would these missiles go? Well, the obvious targets are where people are, in cities. So the city dwellers have become the hostages of the threat and counter-threat of nuclear war.